Moving on then to our final presentation of today's event on business aviation, I would like to welcome Tom Chatfield from Camber Aviation Management. Tom is the Chief Executive Officer for Camber Aviation Management. And just reading his profile, I like his four pillars of aviation: knowledge, experience, innovation, and trust. Tom is also Part 145 and CAMO post holder in the past, so some excellent technical qualification to talk to us today about aircraft reactivation, storing your aircraft and how to wake it up again. Very important in hopefully the post-COVID-19 world in the next few months. Many aircraft have been mothballed, not only in commercial aviation, but I'm sure also in the business aviation sector as well. So I'll hand it over to Tom now if he's ready to take up the reins on this final presentation.
I am, Alan. Thank you very much. Good afternoon for you. Good morning from British Columbia. It's snowing in the mountains and it's bloody cold, so we've had the heat on all night. Can you hear me well?
We can indeed, yes.
Fantastic, fantastic. So thank you very much for your introduction. We thought today that we'd start talking about a very relevant subject, which is basically, as you've said, aircraft reactivation. What we've seen in the past is that aircraft, at least with airlines, tend to be stored very methodically. When an airline is forced to put an aircraft into storage because of economic conditions or because of things such as the pandemic, they have a very strong camo, they know the value of the asset, and they tend to take very good care of putting that aircraft safely to bed. And what we wanted to talk about is those owners that may not be aware of the impact of not putting your aircraft into storage well, and really what can happen with that. So here's a classic example. We all saw it during the financial crisis in I'm sorry, are you not seeing them at the screen? Oh, for fuck's sake.
Sorry,
sorry to share the screen.
We can't see the screen just yet. You want to share the screen there before you kick off?
Have you got it now?
Oh, that's a nice looking motor.
Yes, it is. It is. So thank you for making me aware of it. It showed that it was working on my screen. So yeah, we some of us may remember the financial crisis. Many people in especially Dubai just parked their supercars that they may not have totally paid for close to the airport and wandered off. And in the case of a supercar, it gets dusty, it gets dirty, and you can always roll it into a shop and hope to reclaim it. With an aircraft, it can get a little bit more expensive than that. So what we've decided to do is give you a bit of a background on what storage programs are and what that means. So let's just take a look at what the FAA says, first of all, and at the risk of being a little bit boring, let's just understand what a definition of a storage program is. And essentially what it means is that a storage program is intended to preserve an aircraft when you're essentially no longer flying it. You intend to bring it back into service at some point. And so what you're doing is you're using certain methods, techniques, and procedures to prevent as much as possible the adverse effects of the environment and the non-movement of that aircraft. Now, some of us may have old classic cars. I have an old Austin Healey, and I know every fall I have to bring it into the garage, put it up on jacks, change the oil, and do a few things so that I know in the spring it's going to start again. What we've seen most recently and is a continuing theme is some owners, when they get into a financial situation or we see the effects of the pandemic, will quite often have the philosophy of fire the pilot and park the aircraft. I would tend to say the reverse is perhaps the better way to do it. As long as you still have your pilot or your flying technician or people that you work with regards to that aircraft, take the time, put the aircraft into a proper storage program, make sure it is being taken care of, to make sure that when the aircraft is going to be reactivated again, that not only will it be a smooth and hopefully painless process, but that it's not going to break your wallet as you want to start to fly again. So the FAA and in fact the EASA sort of has three definitions of what storage is. There's a short-term, an intermediate, and a long-term storage. And a short-term storage can be characterized basically irrespective of which OEM that you're talking with, of a program based on sort of 1 and 2 week inspections, which means that the aircraft is parked either outside or inside. And basically what you're doing is you're reactivating that aircraft every 1 to 2 weeks. You're running the systems, you may be doing an engine run occasionally, but basically what you're doing is keeping it in a sort of a suspended animation for a short period of time. What that means is that when it's time to reactivate the aircraft, it's very simple. It's not a very complex process. And generally within a day, you'll have the airplane up and flying again. This is something that the airlines use quite a bit when they're going through overcapacity periods, and they realize that, for example, in the shoulder periods between high and low season, that they may have to put an aircraft down for a short period of time. Intermediate storage and long-term storage tends to be more what we're talking about within business aviation. Intermediate is sort of between 60 and 120 days, and long-term storage means that you consciously know that you're going to be parking the aircraft for a longer period of time. In my opinion, the difference between the two is quite substantial in terms of putting the aircraft into a longer term storage. And if you are an intermediate and you want to then go longer, you actually are taking the aircraft in many cases out of storage and putting it back in again, which costs you time, costs you money, and is not necessarily necessary. The ideal way to do it is if you're looking at having a downtime of 3-4 months plus, you should be putting it into long-term storage. And basically what you're doing there is you're inhibiting the engines and the APU. You are putting desiccators inside the aircraft to make sure that the cabin doesn't go moldy on you. And what you're going to be doing on the rest of the systems, again, depending on who the OEM is you may be inhibiting electrical systems, you may be inhibiting hydraulic systems. And essentially what you're doing is you're covering the aircraft, engines, inlets, everything to make sure that it stays as clean as possible. In an ideal situation, that long-term storage is going to be taking place within a hangar, or at least in a dry environment. There is a huge difference between parking an aircraft in an area such as, let's call it Singapore or San Francisco, which is close to the ocean, simply because of the salt water and the humidity. When you compare that to perhaps parking the aircraft further inland at a dry destination, ideally in a desert or a storage location. So there's a couple of things that are worth understanding then in a storage program. The first thing is, and I use the analogy of a car, is preservation. So if I bring my Healy in for the winter, I'm going to put it up on jacks. I'm going to put fresh oil into it. I'm going to cover the car. And if it was a car that is a limousine, for example, I may put desiccants inside the actual passenger area to keep it dry so the leather doesn't go bad on me. That would be a classic way of doing that. With an aircraft, depending on the kind of aircraft and the period of time that you're going to be storing it, it can be as simple as just simply covering all of the inlets and putting the pitot covers on and keeping it for a short period of time. Or it can include covering the engines, putting desiccants inside them, jacking up the airplane and putting what are called slave wheels or slave brakes on the aircraft. Those are wheels that and tires that are not going to be damaged and will not be reused during the storage period. Basically what we're doing is we're putting a set of old tires on the airplanes so that any flat spots that occur will occur on those slave units. And when we put the original tires back on again, they'll be in good shape and you didn't have to replace the tires or the brakes. The same holds true with the engines themselves. Many engines are very, very susceptible to moisture. So you'll be putting desiccants inside the engine. And there will be a number of tasks that you do during the storage period to refresh the desiccant, for example, and to inspect the engines to make sure there's no corrosion is going on. The storage period itself, again, depending whether it's short, intermediate, or long-term, will depend on the types of tasks that have to be done. The longer the period, the greater the interval between the inspections that have to be done. And as I said, for a short term, it may include an engine run and an APU run. A cycling of the systems on board, including air conditioning. For the longer term storage, it's going to include more of a walk around the aircraft, a walk through the cabin, make sure there's no water ingress going on, and basically making sure the aircraft is in good shape. The deep preservation is, of course, dependent on how deeply you've stored that aircraft or for how long you've stored that aircraft. And as I said, for a short-term period, it's basically since you've been running the engines and running the APU, it's a relatively painless and quick operation. When it is a long-term storage, what you're basically doing is you're de-inhibiting those engines and de-inhibiting the APU. You're taking all of your covers off, you're doing engine runs, pressurization runs, and in some cases, depending on the operator and depending on the OEM, you may be required to do a short test flight. Now, what's important to understand is the length of the deep preservation period is not only important from an owner's perspective in terms of the amount of work that has to be done, but it is incredibly important from an OEM's perspective also. There are some OEMs that require you to do certain things that are relatively easy and benign, but as soon as that engine or that part or that component is kept in for an excessive period of time, you may be required to do a shop visit. Case in point, Camber worked on 2 different BBJ 787s in a completion process. We were the completion managers and oversaw the outfitting process. And during that time period, we had both aircraft actually stored on the ground. In the first aircraft, it was slightly less than 24 months. The second aircraft was more than 24 months. And the OEM, GE, had a requirement that if you had those engines stored for 2 years plus a day, that they would have to come off wing and have a shop visit. So we were very motivated on the first aircraft to make sure that those engines were reactivated before the 2-year period. And in fact, what happened in that case is we actually started the ground testing slightly earlier so that we could de-inhibit those engines and make sure that we wouldn't have to pull them off and put them into a shop visit. As you can imagine, a shop visit isn't only expensive, it's going to take you quite a bit of time, and it's going to prevent you from being able to use that aircraft again as quickly as you wanted to. In the case of the latter aircraft, and it was beyond 2 years, we had planned that into the storage program. We dropped the engines in a timely manner, sent them out to the shops, had them re-inspected, and brought them back in again. So environmental impact. It's quite important that you understand where you're going to be parking the aircraft. The basic storage program that you're going to receive from the airframe OEM, from the engine OEM, and potentially from the APU OEM are going to blend and be very, very similar to one another. But as I said, it depends from one engine manufacturer to another what their actual requirements are and where those critical time limits are. However, what the FAA and the EASA and essentially all other NAAs require is that you as an owner have a storage program that's going to work and is appropriate not only for the aircraft type, but where you're going to be storing it. So for example, you may be able to have a much simpler storage program in terms of the amount of coverings that you have to do and plugs that you have to install in the aircraft if you're going to park it in a hangar. On the other hand, if you're parking it outside in a dusty environment, of course, you want to close all of the orifices on the aircraft to make sure it doesn't fill up with sand. I worked in Qatar for a 4-year period, and we had a Challenger 300 that we brought into maintenance one day for a heavy check. And we were astounded, though, even though this aircraft was parked in the hangar all the time when it wasn't flying, that we pulled out 140 pounds of sand when we were actually doing the inspection. It totally boggled my mind how much sand got into this aircraft. And that's an aircraft that's normally in the hangar. So that kind of thing can happen when you park the aircraft outside and it's perhaps not covered as well as it should be. So the environmental impact depends, as I said, the moisture environment, how much sunlight you've got there, how hot it is, how cold it is. Those are all things that are going to affect that. So you as an owner or having your assigned camo taking a look at it, they will give you some advice in terms of where to park the aircraft. And if you don't have a choice, at least how you would modify that storage program that you have from the OEM to make sure it takes into account the environment where the aircraft's actually going to be parked. So as we said, the preferred storage location, if you have a choice, put it in a hangar. Unfortunately, not everybody has that possibility. So if the hangar is not available, try to find a location that's as dry as possible, especially when we're talking about the intermediate and long-term storages. And I would highly recommend, if you're going to be doing a long-term storage with an aircraft, take it to a location which is dry, but also has MRO facilities so that you have the ability to have people not only periodically inspect the aircraft as the program asks, but also at the same time, when you want to reactivate it, you don't have to bring a whole team in with equipment to actually do that work. So one thing that we have to be careful of is if you have the same aircraft, and let's use the example of a 787, we have a number of different engines that can be installed on that airplane. The same holds true for many large aircraft. In the case of business jets, less so. But essentially what we have to be careful of is that when we're putting together a storage program for an aircraft, and it is not a huge amount of work to do, but what we do have to take into account is the airframe is really, the airframe manufacturer is providing the basics, primarily focused on the aircraft and its systems. And the engine manufacturer may have some additional requirements. So it's highly recommended that when you're actually putting together your storage program, to take a look at the engine maintenance manual, chapter 5, which will give you advice on how to do that properly. Same, of course, holds true for the APU. Now, the shorter the storage program, the more exercise that you're going to be doing to the aircraft. As I said, in the short term, you're basically running the aircraft occasionally. You'll run the power system, the hydraulic systems. You'll run the air conditioning and flight controls. And basically what you're doing is you're trying to keep things moving. One of the reasons you're doing that is because if you leave flight controls locked for a long period of time, you may start having problems with your rod ends. You may have problems with lubrication or with the actual cable assemblies. One thing that shouldn't be forgotten is the desiccants. Depending on where you park and the volume of your aircraft, a large aircraft such as an ACJ or BBJ-1, you will have 4 to 5 large garbage cans with desiccators mounted on top of them. And I've seen those fill up in as quickly as a week. So obviously, if you're going to leave them in there and not inspect them more than a week, depending on your environment, you may very quickly find yourself having large amounts of water spilling out and going under the floorboards. So some of the pitfalls that you have when you're actually parking the aircraft, again, in a storage facility that works quite well, they basically park the aircraft in a location. It's far away from other aircraft. And unless you have horrible windstorms, things tend to be quite good. The problem with parking an aircraft on a ramp is the same as if you park an aircraft on a ramp overnight. There can always be damage that occurs from moving ground support equipment, other aircraft being moved around. These kind of things happen. The other thing is, of course, the loss of plugs or protective covers. As the wind starts picking up or you have inclement weather, it's quite easy to lose those parts. So the manufacturers basically recommend that you're using different types of tapes to make sure that those plugs and covers are staying in position. Any of those covers not in the right position, or you haven't covered all of the various access points or panels on your aircraft, you'll then see sand, dust, and moisture getting in there. And the more moisture you get into your aircraft, the more mold that you're going to have. I was involved in an aircraft some years ago. The aircraft did not have any desiccant put inside it, and it was parked in a very damp environment. And after 6 weeks, we had mold on just about every surface that was covered with leather. So all the leathers were covered in mold. We had to spend quite a bit of money to have the leathers all redone on the aircraft. They were all discolored, and it wasn't very nice. And the smell in that airplane was, frankly, was awful. The other thing that's very, very often neglected is the UV damage that happens not only to the paint, the windshields, and the passenger windows, is basically in very, very bright conditions, as you have in a desert. Sometimes it's forgotten that you have to cover the windshields and the passenger windows to make sure that you don't damage those. They become crazed or become porous after time. And lastly, the engine cowls, those and wings and tail leading edges, the ones that are polished so nicely, suggest covering them. There's different tapes that can be applied by 3M that work very, very well to prevent the erosion, and definitely will save you a lot of money when it's time to polish them again. You won't have all the pitting and corrosion that you would otherwise have. In terms of documentation, again, sometimes neglected. The storage program has to be approved by your local authority. If you've got a camo that's relatively simple, the camo will run that for you. If you're in an environment where you don't have a camo, then your maintenance planning department should essentially put that document together and then issue the work packages in a timely manner to make sure that that work is done. The camo or your maintenance planning group will then oversee the storage period and make sure that everything is documented very well. I'm sure that my colleague who does aircraft assessments and appraisals will agree with me that if you haven't documented your storage period, it's very hard then to prove it to owners and to evaluation experts. And you may find yourself actually losing value in your aircraft for that. Or equally important, having to redo maintenance tasks. What's important then is as we come out of the depreservation, finally the COVID pandemic has hopefully ended, or your financial situation has gotten better, demand is picking up again. It's time to preserve the aircraft. Again, relatively straightforward. You're following the storage program that you've developed, which follows the OEM. You've taken all your plugs off. You're going to be doing basically your engine runs, your APU runs, exercising all of your systems. And then, not to be forgotten, for that period of time where the aircraft has actually been on the ground, there's still scheduled maintenance tasks that would have been done. So if a C check became due during the preservation period, you would have to do the C check. The same thing for out of phase tasks, A checks, whatever tasks that you have, anything that runs by calendar is going to become due, or at least continues to run during the period. The next is, of course, compliance with the latest NAA requirements. So for example, if ADS-B became a requirement while you stored the aircraft, then it is a requirement when you bring in the aircraft out of storage. And by doing that, that means that you have to, as a CAMO or as a maintenance planning group, plan for these things and make sure that the aircraft is now going to be modified as required. Lastly, take a look at the airworthiness directives. Of course, we know that the authorities don't sleep when your aircraft does. So what will happen is new ADs will be coming out. So essentially what you need to do is your CAMO or your maintenance planning group is, while the aircraft is in storage, should be continuing to monitor the scheduled maintenance tasks, taking a look at the latest NAA requirements, the airworthiness directives that come out, and start putting together a maintenance package that will then be released when the aircraft actually is scheduled for depreservation. This may affect where you're going to be depreserving the aircraft. If you're at a storage facility, they may be able to do the basics, but you may have to ferry the aircraft to an MRO depending on the work that has to be done. So take that into account. And lastly, you have to put special attention on the serviceability of emergency equipment. As we all know, emergency equipment is calendar controlled, some of them as short as 1 year. So it's quite often the case that if you're not watching your emergency equipment, some of that equipment is actually going to run out during the storage period. There, our recommendation is take the emergency equipment off, whether it's your fire extinguishers or your oxygen tanks, whatever you have that's portable on the aircraft, take it out of the aircraft, make sure that it's going to be recertified before you put it back into the airplane. You may even take the advantage of doing some of that work in advance so that you don't have to do those tasks once the airplane re-enters service. And lastly, I'd like to say thank you. Once you've done this whole process, it is complicated, but I can guarantee you it is much, much cheaper than trying to reactivate an old car or a car that was left at the airport in Dubai. If you plan a storage program very well, and the effort is small compared to the rewards that you're going to get, it's going to make your reactivation much simpler, much less expensive, and of course your downtime is going to be much, much shorter. So you'll be able to go out and enjoy that aircraft again, whether it's you or for your client. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. That was very insightful and great overview of what's involved in putting aircraft into long-term storage or short-term storage, as the case may be, and how to reactivate them again after the storage period. Just a couple of points from my side. I think we're all familiar on this side of the pond, as we say, with the CAMO under the EASA regulation. Is it true to say that there is no such thing as a CAMO under FAA regulations, that there's no strict requirement to follow, let's say, airworthiness directives or service bulletins in an FAA storage environment?
No, I wouldn't say that. So fundamentally, there's a difference between how things are done in Europe, and I've got an EASA license, so I'm quite familiar with that, and how it is done in the FAA. So in fact, I'm Canadian, so we even have it different in Canada. What we have is in Europe, you have a CAMO, which is basically your continuing airworthiness maintenance organization. They are your planning group. And what they're doing is they're continuously taking the aircraft maintenance program that has been approved by the NAA, updating it and applying that maintenance program to the aircraft and essentially scheduling the maintenance that has to be done. That's a scheduled maintenance. The CAMO does exactly the same thing for unscheduled maintenance. They make sure that when something goes wrong on the aircraft, you have to replace a tire, for example, or there's certain work that has to be done. They oversee that, make sure the paperwork is done properly and that the aircraft has a proper release to service. The same holds true then for national requirements that apply to the aircraft or for ADs. In the United States, for a private operator operating under, for example, Part 91, basically what happens there is the operator is responsible for the continuing airworthiness, and they can determine how they're going to do it. Some of the larger operators have essentially a camo function that they have through their own planning group. However, if you're a single operator, what often happens is you will use a maintenance planning tool such as Camp, and basically work together with your MRO to make sure that these tasks are done in a timely manner. Often it's assigned to the chief pilot. I think a lot of chief pilots, unfortunately, are overwhelmed with that. It's quite a complicated task on some aircraft. So it would be well advised for an owner to have someone that actually does that for them and to contract it out. Essentially, whether you call it camo or not, those functions still have to take place. I would say from a former post holder that I like the camo system in Europe. It's well structured. It has a very good system of checks and balances and a very good quality system on it. And that's not to say that doesn't happen in the United States. Some operators really do that very, very well and set up something that's very, very similar to a camo to make sure it happens.
What happens if the airline hands the aircraft back to the lessor? The lessor, who's not an operator, has the aircraft now to put into storage in the FAA environment. Who's responsible for that?
Ultimately, it always comes down to the owner of the aircraft. So I worked for GCAS for quite some time, and that was always a problem because the lessor always wanted to take a hands-off approach on that. So if an aircraft is coming back, it has to fulfill the lease return conditions. But at that point, what the lessor is trying to do is basically do a back-to-back lease, basically hand it to the next airline or to the next owner in the case of a business jet. And if that's not possible, they will often contract someone to actually do that work for them, to oversee and to do the camo function, whether it's on an N register or in a Canadian or a European register.
Very good. Okay, thanks for that. Any questions from the audience in terms of reactivation of aircraft? I mean, is there anything specific to business jets that don't apply to commercial aircraft, for instance, Tom, that you can think of?
There is one, and it does happen to both, but we're seeing it more in business jets, and it's something that the Camber has now gotten very actively involved in, and that is those aircraft, like I showed that Ferrari parked in a parking lot in Dubai. We have had cases recently where owners have, for one of three reasons, basically parked their aircraft and then not sure how to get it out again. And I'm saying specifically parked and not stored. What's happened is either there's financial distress or a loss of interest in the aircraft, or loss of requirement, I should say, or, for example, the effects of the pandemic. An owner will have parked the aircraft and basically walked away from it. They now come back perhaps 6 months, a year or 2 years and say, okay, I'd like to operate my airplane again. Have no infrastructure, no pilots anymore, no contracted maintenance organization. In some cases, the engines are full of sand. The airplane obviously hasn't gone through a storage program. And so there's a real problem there. Camber has been contracted in a number of cases recently where we've been asked to go in, assess the airplane in terms of what is the condition of the airplane, develop a work package which we believe is appropriate to get the airplane back into an airworthiness status, and then recommend that either to the camo that the owner has or to the owner's representative. And then we basically oversee that entire process. And in some cases, if the aircraft's been parked, for example, at a remote location or a place that doesn't have an MRO, it means us bringing in a crew that will basically do the minimum to get the airplane into a serviceable condition. I won't say airworthy, I'll say serviceable, so you can actually ferry that airplane to an MRO and do that work. And I've been surprised how often that's happened, whether it's a situation where a bank has repossessed the aircraft and not known how to bring it back, or the case of an owner who is overwhelmed by it. And as we all know, when someone's overwhelmed with a complex problem, you can either go and find an expert or you can do nothing. And many people tend to do nothing until they finally realize, we need an expert to take a look at this. And quite often that's when our phone rings.
Very interesting. Any questions from the audience before we finish up? There's one actually in the news recently, Tom. I'm not sure if you saw it or not, two Lufthansa 747s that were parked in Holland.
Yeah.
And now they can't fly out again. What was the reason for that? Do you remember?
Well, that was quite interesting. The airport has the runway length to be able to take off, but because of noise abatement procedures, they're not allowed to have every aircraft departing that airport. And I guess someone missed that when they were planning to park those aircraft there. So they were allowed to fly in because that's not affected quite as heavily on the departure procedures, obviously. And once the airplanes got there, everyone started scratching their heads trying to figure out how to get the airplanes out. They did end up getting dispensation from the authorities, but I think a couple of people had a little bit of egg on their face.
That's another little angle on parking and storing aircraft that you have to keep in mind, I'm sure.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Okay, yeah, if there's no more questions or comments, I'm going to thank you, Tom, again for your input there. It was very good.